Hello again, everyone. All right, so today I'm going to answer another question from the comments. By the way, guys, sorry for the momentary hiatus. Had to deal with some personal things, family things, but I'm back now, and hopefully I can address more of these questions in a more timely fashion. So let's see here. Let's go to this comment. It says, "Hey man, just like the dude said, there's literally almost no one on the freaking internet helping or explaining anything in depth for the JD-08. So I thank you very, very much. And by the way, you need more videos, bro. You're an amazing teacher and explain things very well. Thank you so much for the support. Thank you so much, by the way. I also noticed the same thing. Yeah, you're right. There aren't a lot of resources in regard to the JD-08 online outside the user manual, which kind of reads like stereo instructions sometimes. But so hopefully I'll be able to get more videos up and out on this. So let's take a look at the question. So you say, I had a question. I tried to connect my JD-08 with my MPC-1, and for the life of me, I cannot get these two to play nicely. One thing I tried that helped somewhat was moving all the JD-08 MIDI channels to the same channel, master, part A, part B, etc., because I don't believe you can have a single MIDI track in MPC controlling channels 1 through 4. I could be wrong. However, when I do this and play the JD-08 on the pads, I get a forever sustain, like I'm continuing to hold down whichever note I pressed first. I'm sorry, I know this is a very scattered group of questions, but if you could somehow help explain any of it, that would be amazing. Thanks. Well, you're in luck. So I have been experimenting with MIDI channels or MIDI tracks in conjunction with the MPC environment. So let's take a look. Let's see what we have. So right now, what we're looking at is an empty project for the MPC. I'm using the MPC Live 2. You're using MPC 1, but the software, or should I say the environments, are pretty much synonymous to one another. It's all the same, particularly with the MPC 1 Plus, which was just recently released. And in conjunction with that, I also have the JD-08 here. So what we're going to do initially is we're going to configure both the MPC and the JD-08 so that they speak to one another. So let's talk about this infinite sustain thing. I'm not 100% sure as to what's causing that, but what I do know is that the MPC and the JD-08 share a rather unique relationship when it comes down to MIDI. For example, the transport controls automatically trigger the JD-08 sequencer. Now this I'm not particularly a fan of. I don't like that all of the time. The reason being is because the MPC has its own sequencer, and maybe I want to use the MPC sequencer as opposed to using the JD-08 sequencer. Well, how do I make that happen? How do I play a sequence here without playing a sequence here? Well, let's go into a few of our MIDI settings. So I'll go into menu. Okay, one's first inclination would be to go to the MIDI control, but I would say don't do this. The MIDI control menu is more or less used for MIDI mapping. For example, if you had an external peripheral or an external MIDI controller, MIDI device, and you wanted to use that to control the MPC. Well, what we're trying to do is the antithesis. We're trying to use the MPC to control something external. So for that, I would go into preferences, and then I would go under the MIDI sync menu. Right now, I am using MIDI port A and running into the JD-08's MIDI. I'm sorry, I'm using the output of MIDI port A and running into the input of the JD-08. So the reason that the sequencer starts running is because right now the transport controls are synced to the JD-08. So we can fix that by identifying our output, that being MPC A, And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to deactivate sync, and I'm going to deactivate track. So now what's happening is that number one, we don't have to worry about the transport controls triggering the sequencer. But then number two, and this is the question you may be asking, if I'm not synced via the output port, then does that mean that the MPC is inert at this point? Does that mean that it will not trigger anything? And the answer to the question is no, it will. It'll still send MIDI information without that infinite sustain situation. I'll give you an example. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take track number one. I'm just going to call it JD-08. All right. Track number one, JD-08. I'm gonna configure it as or I'll select the MIDI track option. And so now we have our MIDI program. MIDI looks very binary at this point. MIDI 001, right? Well, that's a little perfunctory, so let's do something else. We'll just call it JD-08. Okay. So we have MIDI track, we have MIDI program. All right. Our MIDI port, we already identified it as being MPC A, and our program channel, right now it's switched off, so we're completely inert at this point. So now the question is, what channel do we want to use? What I found interesting about the JD-08, well, actually no, that's not true. I was going to say that each layer has its own MIDI channel, but I don't think that that's the case. I know that each layer may or may not have its own track when you run audio over USB, but that's a different story altogether. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to make sure that our JD-08 is set for the appropriate MIDI tracks. So let's see. Part, I think, hold on, let's see which, turn off note. Let's see, number 9, yes. So once you hit common, option number 9 will take you to your MIDI menu. So you have your master channel, channel A, channel B. These are the 3 parameters that are of interest at the moment. All right, so notice how I have the master channel off. I did this with purpose. Again, this is going to prevent any unwanted triggers from a MIDI standpoint. However, because I'm extremely particular and granular when it comes down to how I want the JD-08 to, how I want the MPC to interact with the JD-08, I'm just going to take layer A, or part A, let me rephrase, part A, and I'm going to map it to MIDI channel number 1. Part B is mapped to MIDI channel number 4. Okay. So remember, if you hold, let's see. So remember, if you hold note, you can vacillate between part B and part A, respectively. A, B, A, B. So right now, I am on part A. In one of my previous videos, I explained the difference between parts A and part B. Think of them, well, for all intents and purposes, and to be succinct, it's basically the equivalent of having 2 JD-08s side by side with one another. JD-08A, JD-08B, each complete with their own parameters, each complete with their own sequencers, etc., etc. So right now, I'm only worried about part A. Okay, so now that I have part A set to program channel number 1, I'm going to set my program channel to number 1. Okay. Oh, that's interesting. One thing I just realized is that when because it's switching the programs, that's true. So whenever I switch the programs here with the MPC, I can, there we are. So 0 would be patch okay, would be patch A1. Okay, so I can actually switch the programs through the MPC. Interesting. Okay. But interesting. So again, you can switch your programs with the MPC, and because we're mapped to the A output, we can trigger each part independent of one another. All right, now let's have a little bit of fun, shall we? We're going to go into pad performance. Pad performance is actually one of my favorite features of the MPC. I happen to be a person who is well versed with music theory. That's where I come from. But I'm enjoying the ease of use with the MPC because for the individual who is not well versed in music theory, you have a variety of options here. Like, for example, you have your chromatic scales, you have your notes mode, chords mode, which basically allows you to play like full all-out chords at the tap of a pad. This is your typical triad, your 1-3-5 triad. And you can also select your key as well as the type of chord that you want to play. Now, if I'm not mistaken, okay, so it's continuous root note. Okay, gotcha. All right, so what would be really, really cool is if the MPC had inversions. I don't think I've ever looked for that before, but either which way. Well, you can actually customize your own chords. But anyway, I digress. So let's just say, for example, we go into chords mode, and let's go for something interesting. So we have our standard triads, 1-3-5. We have our sus chords, 1-4-5 and 1-2-5. We have our 7 chords, and we have our dominant chords. So, and again, for someone well versed in music theory, basically what's happening here is that you have your 1-3-5s, which are your like I said, standard triads. A sus chord basically takes the 3 from the basic triad, and it shifts it either up a note letter or down a note letter, right? So same thing happens here, just in reverse. So instead of 1-3-5, you have 1-4-5, 1-2-5. You have your major 7 chords here, which actually sound really, really cool. I'm a huge fan of those. And then you have your dominant chords, which sound very bluesy, but due to the flat 7. So sounds like an ice cream truck. But the reason that that's happening is because we are using major chords. Now, if we use... let's change the program. Let's see. Actually, no, these are scales. These are scales. So that is irrelevant. If I wanted to do that, I would go into progressions. But anyway, let's go back to the main menu here. And let's switch the program here. Sounds like a choo-choo train. That's pretty neat. Okay, well, let's go back to pad performance, and let's see if we can get some progressions going. Sounds like I'm in a lower octave here. Let's see, what kind of chord types do we want? Classic major. Ooh. I see what it's doing. So what it's doing is it's separating the chord progressions into categories, and I can actually select a different root note, which ultimately decides the key signature. So if I want to be in the key of D and I want, like deep house chords. Oh, that's wild. And they're all in key as well. And the list goes on and on. Okay. So in order to prevent that endless sustain situation, my one suggestion that I would make is make sure that your envelope is set to where your release is not maximized. So like, say for example, if I was to go into the TVA, the time variant amplifier, thank you, Roland. The time variant amplifier. If I were to increase the time switch here, just maximize the time switch and maximize the level, then what's going to wind up happening is I'm going to have that situation where it takes a moment for the note to release, to decay out. No, not decay out, but release. So it's just going to go on and on and on and on and on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to decrease the time there. So that way the amplifier closes when unwanted. All right. So there we have it. I mean, it's actually quite simple, nothing to it, outside of just making sure that you are using the correct MIDI channels, understanding how your program changes work, setting up your MIDI tracks, and most importantly, knowing how to navigate your MIDI sync preferences. And that's it. There we have it. Okay, guys. So I'm going to close out now. Again, keep the questions coming. I'm going to address more of these. I've had a few pile up on me. I think I might do some more MPC stuff. I think one of the questions revolved around compression. I use a lot of sidechain compression with my mixes as a mixing technique, also as an effect. So more of that's to come. So, as always, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. I will address them as quickly as I can. Outside of that, that's pretty much it. All right, I'll talk to you guys soon. Thank you.